to tell you a little bit about our next guest, and I'm pleased to welcome, he's a real celebrity and a member of the Internet Hall of Fame, Vint Cerf, who is, his formal title is Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google, and he's widely known as the father of the Internet, for which he and his colleague Robert Kahn were presented the U.S. National Medal of Technology in 1997. In 2004, he was a recipient of the ACM Alan M. Turing Award, which is sometimes called the Nobel Prize for Computer Science. And in 2005, he was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President George Bush. And Vint began his work at DARPA and played a huge role in leading the development of the internet and internet-related data, packet, and security technologies. And since 2005, he's been at Google, where he's responsible for identifying new technologies to support the development of advanced internet-based products and services. And he's also an active public face for Google in the internet world. So it's my pleasure. Put your hands together and please welcome Mr. Vint Cerf to the stage. Welcome, father of the internet.
Well, I'm just one of them. Remember,
okay.
there's more than one.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Hey, there's also mothers of the internet. A lot of people ask that question. You say, "Who's the mother of the internet?" There are actually quite a number of women who played a key role in developing the system way back in the late 60s and early 70s. So just FYI, that's very
yes,
important.
thank you. Who are those women? Can you name a couple?
Sure. The first gateway, which you would call a router today, was written by Virginia Strausazar, who was at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, the company that made the ARPANET IMPs, the interface message processors. Those were the packet switches of the ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet. Another gal is Radia Perlman. Radia was, you might know her because of her work on routing and redundancy and reliability. She was the one that developed spanning tree algorithms for local area networks. I mean, after they got big, you started hooking these various local area nets together and you would get routing loops and other kinds of things. So Radia figured out how to do fast spanning tree calculations in order to make sure the packets didn't get stuck in a loop. But she also did some really interesting work solving a problem that I cared a great deal about. What I worried about with the internet was the possibility that some of the networks that made up the internet might be partitioned. And the internet routing system couldn't detect that. And so if there were hosts on either side of a partition and one was trying to talk to the other, you couldn't get through there because there was no routing path because the network, the subnet had partitions. So she figured out a way to dynamically renumber the systems in order to glue everything back together. We actually tested that by artificially breaking up the ARPANET into pieces, and then we put packet radios on the ground and in strategic air command aircraft, and we glued the system back together using packet radios. That was pretty exciting.
That's amazing, and I really do appreciate you bringing that up because women are playing a big, huge role in technology and the development. We have some amazing developers and engineers as women at AWS, and I just read a statistic the other day that says now at MIT in computer science, 53% are women.
That's good to hear.
So it's like amazing.
So just, if you don't mind, just to name one other person, Deborah Estrin, who is one of 3 women who are the daughters of my thesis advisor and his wife, both of whom had their PhDs. Deborah is a PhD who just got into the National Academy of Medicine after having been inducted into the National Academy of Engineering a few years back.
Oh, wow.
So she's in both academies.
We need that.
Her older sister, Margot, is an MD in Walnut Creek. And her other older sister is Judy Estrin, who is a serial entrepreneur out on the West Coast, started 6 different companies, became the CTO of Cisco Systems, and who was my student at Stanford University.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
So, you know, wow.
Well, and in fact, before I jump in, we were just chatting about the fact he and I had written a common recommendation for an amazing young girl from TJ that got into Harvard, Kavya, which she came and did an internship. So it's fun to see amazing women doing amazing things.
Well, you're sitting right here as another example.
With you, which is good. And we are so excited to have you here this year. It's a real honor for us. I've got a few questions for you.
Okay.
So, as you know, 2019 marks the 40th anniversary for our event here. We said we feel much younger some days and much older others. But when we were planning the conference, we were adamant that we wanted to focus on kind of looking forward. But I'm going to break the rule for a minute and kind of ask you briefly about your reflection back in 1979, because I know that was a really important year, and kind of when you were working, what were some of the challenges you grapple with then, and do you see kind of any correlation from there till now, some similar things?
So like every graduate student, you get a question and you work with it so that you can answer it. So I'm going to work with this question just a little bit.
Okay.
We are about to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the first exchange between two computers on the predecessor to the internet, the ARPANET, next week.
Oh, wow.
It was October 29th. So October 29, 1969, 50 years ago, we made the first interconnection between UCLA and SRI International up in Menlo Park. And so we're celebrating that 50th anniversary, but now let's skip forward to 1979. I was in Washington, D.C. I was running the internet program for the Defense Department at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. 1979 was after we had frozen the TCP/IP protocols, the IP version 4 and TCP. And I was pushing like crazy to get it implemented on every operating system I could get my hands on, in the hope that we could get this thing actually built and tested, because we'd spent from 1973 to 1979 iterating on the design of the protocols, implementing them, finding out what didn't work, going back, changing them, and then eventually when we get everything, more or less stable, we froze the protocols and then started implementing on all kinds of operating systems. Because 40 years ago, there were lots of different operating systems. Every company in the business, computing business, had their own operating system. So we pushed very hard to do all those implementations, and then at the beginning of 1982, John Postel, who was responsible for the domain name system to come, which hadn't been invented yet, but he was also responsible for all of the address allocation for the internet protocols, announced that we would switch from the ARPANET protocols to TCP/IP on January 1, 1983.
Wow.
So from the 1979 perspective, we're looking towards that milestone. And I'm doing whatever I can as a program manager to try to convince the private sector to implement these protocols at IBM, Hewlett-Packard, and the Digital Equipment Corporation. And of course, the corporate commercial parts of the companies didn't want to have anything to do with this.
Yeah.
I mean, why would you want to use a non-proprietary protocol that would allow one of your customers to connect a non-brand machine? Like IBM didn't want to have Digital Equipment Corporation machines floating around polluting the SNA environment, and DECnet had the same view, and HP had. So I went to the laboratories, research laboratories of IBM and Digital Equipment Corporation and HP, and I said, would you guys like to try working on this little internet idea? And of course, the engineers are saying, wow, that's cool. So they went off and they built TCP/IP for their systems without the rest of the corporation knowing anything about it. And then when the salespeople showed up and the customers said, well, thank you very much. It's nice to know you have this proprietary networking protocol. But what about this TCP/IP thing? And of course, the sales guy says, what's that? And the engineer that they brought along with them says, oh, we have that in the lab. And eventually, people recognized that having an open architecture and an open set of protocols that allowed all these different brands to interact and multiple networks to interact was actually a good thing.
Yeah.
So that was what I was focused on 40 years ago.
And that's kind of come back around, right? I mean, think about now what's happening. People want to share what they're doing, open design, open architecture. I bet that people were not thinking about security that much back then, as much as they are now because of the changes. I'm sure, I mean, in government, security's always been a thing, right? But here it's now, we're in a little different time.
This is the part where I get beat up because the system isn't secure enough. First of all, by 1975, before I even got from Stanford back to ARPA, I was working with NSA on a secure version of the system. The problem is that the equipment that I had to use at the time was classified
Right.
cryptography. So I couldn't share what the design details were with the other graduate students and participants in the internet program who were not cleared. So I was schizoid for a while because I knew how to do this. Eventually, of course, RSA came along, public key cryptography came along. Around 1976, the first paper comes out with Diffie and Marty Hellman. RSA comes out a couple of years later, and we retrofit quite a bit of that technology into the growing ARPANET. There's still, internet. There's still a huge amount of work to be done, though.
Yeah.
It's not just technical, it's also getting people comfortable with using efficient and secure mechanisms like two-factor authentication and applying cryptography wherever we can, both for confidentiality and also digital signatures for integrity. So we have a lot of work to do to get this into the system where everyone is comfortable using it as a matter of course.
Agree. You still see basic things that can be done that aren't always done. So let's talk about ARPANET for a minute. The creation of ARPANET was a really perfect example, I think, of how government and industry really can successfully do something together to create a very disruptive technology. And at this point, would you say there's other things that are out there that we could be doing, should be doing? Is there a model we should think about from there?
Absolutely. So let me take the two things. The ARPANET was an experiment in a homogeneous network. The packet switches were all the same, connecting heterogeneous machines with their different operating systems, word sizes, character encoding, and everything. It was a very diverse jungle of computing equipment. So demonstrating the interoperability of heterogeneous machines was very important. Bob Kahn and I started from there and said, well, what about different kinds of networks, mobile radio, satellite, wireline systems, eventually, optical fiber, and things like that. How do we get these different kinds of packet switch nets to interact with each other? That was the internet design. So let's fast forward now. Here it is, it's 2019. We see significant cloud activity at AWS, at Google, at Microsoft, at IBM and other places, but they are largely isolated from each other. And the customers are starting to realize that there's some value in being able to move things back and forth between clouds. So instead of internet, we have an interesting intercloud possibility.
Yes.
One of the things that's helping with that, of course, is the notion of containers. At Google, it's Kubernetes. There are other variations on that. Docker, for example. And so that's one thing where you can take a chunk of code and it will run in more than one cloud. And then the idea of being able to move data back and forth in some convenient way, it says intercloud might be part of our future. And I can imagine a customer saying, well, I know that if I go to this cloud, I get certain capabilities that might be unique. It might be, maybe it's Google's quantum computing or it's TensorFlow stuff. And I'm not conversant enough with AWS
Well, I
special
can help
features.
you out with that. If you need me to talk about that, no teasing.
So the idea here is to give freedom and flexibility to the consumers of these platforms, the ability to move things around conveniently and at need. It also allows them to deal with outages and other kinds of things. The one thing I will say that I don't know that we know how to do this, but if you have access control, need access control for the data that you are hosting on any one of the clouds, trying to move from one cloud to another and still achieving the access control you need is, as far as I can tell, a somewhat unsolved challenge because you have to have accounts and authentication and all kinds of other stuff. But I think that's solvable just as the internet problem was solvable.
Yeah, totally. And customers want access to their data and they want to be able to use it how they need to use it, and that's the reality.
Well, but they also don't want somebody else to use it who doesn't have the authority to, and that's important.
Hence our security conversation, right, which is so important. And so one of the things, last night we had the CIO from the city of Philadelphia here, and he kind of showed us what they've been working on here in Philadelphia was trying to merge 300 data sets to pull some APIs together to have a full view map of the city and everything going on. Very interesting city, like every city with their own complexities and things that they need to solve, but the key is they want to get more information out to those citizens. So you understand that, Vint, you understand the customer and the citizen experience. Over the years, are there tools that you've personally used or seen used that you think actually really does help with that experience to make sure that you're working fast to give the citizen or customer experience everything it needs to be?
Well, I would be misrepresenting things if I said that my fingers had gotten deeply dirty with some of these applications. But I will say that I've watched other cities, Singapore in particular, as a city-state, become extremely interested in understanding how the city works by measuring what's going on. But the part that's the most interesting is having a model of how the city is supposed to work based on the metrics
Yes.
that they have. And so they can observe what's going on and measure what's going on and compare that with the model that's predicting what should happen. Let me give you an example from our cloud at Google, just because I know that one better than I do the others. It's a big system like the others are, and there's always something broken. I mean, you can't build a system on this scale without something being broken. And of course, we know when we've sent an error message to somebody because our code sent it. And so we can say, I just sent an error message to so-and-so. So we track a lot of what's going on at different layers in this architecture to sense when things are not working right. And when they get past a certain level of failure rate, you know, all the alarm bells go off and people run around trying to figure out what happened. Like, oh, we just released a piece of software that didn't do what we thought it was supposed to do, so we have to find a way to back out of that. The idea of instrumenting and measuring levels of behavior and comparing that to the predicted model is a really powerful tool. And the cities, I think, have an opportunity to build models of how the city is supposed to work. So Singapore is busily doing that. It sounds like Philadelphia might be doing the same thing. Others could do that as well. And it gets me all excited, because if you think about the Internet of Things and the possibility of pulling state information from all of them in order to understand what's going on, and then to try simulations where, you know, all the power goes out in this part of the city, what should we do? You know, what's the right way to reroute traffic? How do I deal with the pumps that are not working? All those scenarios have the possibility of being exercised in simulation so that you can figure out ahead of time what the right responses are for some of the problems that could arise, either a natural disaster or maybe a mistake somebody made.
I so agree with you. I think the simulation technologies is such a great way now for the cities to plan, or federal government, for all the possibilities that we may not even know about today. So you and I were talking a little bit backstage on education, accessibility, and there's accessibility in many ways, but one of the challenges that we still have is truly accessibility of the technology into all these communities. I was just in Africa and Zambia for a couple of weeks in August, and I was blown away by the number of people and how they were using, everybody had like a phone in their phone stands, but how do you get access even in the most remote areas? Tell me about your thinking on that and ideas that you may have to help improve. I think we're all thinking about that. With like your thoughts.
Don't you just love these puffball questions?
Yeah,
Thank you. I
you
appreciate that. Okay, so there's accessibility is a really important word because I want to parse it several different ways. Okay, so one of them is, how do I get access to this system? How do I get access to the internet and all of its resources? Well, one answer, of course, is undersea fiber networks connecting continents together, and terrestrial fiber networks to bring high bandwidth to at least, if not homes, at least to central locations. But the next big thing, which may or may not materialize, is what Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and others are doing to put satellites up in low and very low Earth orbit. We're talking 14 to 20,000 satellites. And of course, you know, my head kind of blows up when I think, are they all going to bump into each other? And what if they're in polar orbit? Do they all collide right there in the North Pole and they all fall down? So obviously there's a lot of clever dynamics that have to be dealt with. On the presumption, though, that they're successful in getting these things somewhere between 700 kilometers and 1,100 kilometers orbit, that's a very short distance, so the delays will be de minimis compared to a synchronous satellite, which is 22,400 miles away. It's about a quarter of a second up and down. Low Earth orbit satellites are going to be 50 milliseconds or less. So it feels more like a continental delay at most. So that's very exciting. It might turn out that it'll be impossible to avoid access to the internet if they're successful. Now, there's an issue about sustainability and cost. And if the costs are too high, then it won't be affordable, and then it won't solve the problem. From my point of view, though, it's a really exciting possibility. Right now, the statistics are that about 50% of the world is online.
Yeah.
And of course, it's sort of spread all over everywhere. It's not like these countries are 100% online and these are 0. Everywhere there is some lack of access. Here in the United States, it's particularly unfortunate in the rural parts of the country, especially the Native American reservations are very, very isolated.
Yes.
So I've been spending a lot of my time trying to figure out how to fix that problem.
Yes.
To the extent that I can. So you're right. Now, that's one kind of accessibility. The other one has to do with usability. How do I use the system? How do I use the applications? What if I'm blind? What if I'm deaf? Well, I'm hearing impaired. I wear 2 hearing aids. And so captions are a big deal for me, especially in a noisy environment. What if I have mobility problems? Those are hard challenges to tackle, because if you're a programmer writing a new application, whether it's for a mobile or a tablet or a laptop, you have to learn how to think about what will happen to someone who doesn't have the flexibility and freedom to see all 2 dimensions, can't see the blinking cursors, has to experience the application in some serial way, as you would with a blind assistive technology like JAWS, where you're tapping keys and you're hearing where the system is. So learning how to do that is hard. Most programmers do not have an intuitive feel for that. And the people who use those assistive technologies have become really, really good at it.
Yes.
And if you're a programmer who's never experienced that, the intuition isn't there. So it's a gigantic, creative, and very important challenge to overcome.
I've seen, it's so interesting, our Alexa, our Echo, I've seen so many people using that for all of these amazing accessibility applications, even from lights to noise, the things that, you know, the impairment that you have, how do you utilize technology in a way that really gets you what you need. But I think there's all different ways, and we have a lot to do, I think, in both of those areas still, unfortunately, on both levels of accessibility.
We have a very cool story to tell. We have a deaf Russian programmer named Dmitry Kanevsky at Google. And you know, he's trying to sit in meetings and can't follow the conversation because you have to look around and lip read, and that's too hard. So he took our speech understanding and speech recognition technology and stuck it in a mobile. And the mobile now transcribes in 70 or more languages. And so he very cleverly just sits there, and if he's talking to somebody, he can hold the thing close enough to get good signal to noise ratio, and he just gets the streaming text. And so next step, of course, is getting me speaking English and Dmitry speaking Russian and having it translate back and forth.
Right.
These technologies are becoming pretty exciting. The more horsepower we get in the devices that are off at the edge of the net or in our pockets or our purses.
And so it's amazing, machine learning and AI is becoming a big part of our everyday life, and we don't even know it. So now I want to talk to you a minute about leadership and leadership in government. When you were in government, and this happens at big corporations too, but leadership in government, I think, can be a unique challenge in terms of how do you figure out how to get things done faster? And when it's your time, how did you see, when you were in government, were there unique characteristics of leaders that were successful in getting things done faster in government?
Yes. Now, you have to remember, I was with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is not like anything you would ever find in most of the rest of government. First of all, it's a small organization with a few hundred people. They bring in program managers that have bees in their bonnets. My bee was internet. And they basically say, here's a budget, go make something happen. And please don't do anything illegal. And so we had huge flexibility. We were able to take the problem that we had and go find the smartest people in the country to try to work on them. And so we had enormous flexibility. Today, it's not quite as simple We do broad area announcements, though, and we can and frame the problem. George Heilmeyer used to be the director of ARPA some years ago. He eventually became the head of research for Texas Instruments after leaving ARPA. But he had a kind of a catechism, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Why do we care about it in the Defense Department? What's new about your idea? Why should you be the one to solve that? Why is it timely to do that? And P.S., how much is it going to cost? So this catechism was a tremendous way of getting the people coming in with proposals to crisply explain what they could do, why they should do it, and that helped us very quickly zero in on tasks that we could do. Now, DARPA did something else some years ago. They had this grand challenge idea, and one of them was self-driving vehicles. Yeah. You can imagine why that would be important for the military. So when the first challenge came out, and a bunch of typical universities responded to this, and I don't think anybody's car got more than 7 kilometers on the 128-kilometer track that they were supposed to go on before they ended up in the ditch. Yeah. The next year, Stanford University won. Sebastian Thrun was pushing that. And next year after that, Carnegie Mellon's team won, and it was inside a simulated town. And so Google hired both teams, and then it eventually ended up with the Waymo company, which some of you know, has been driving self-driving cars, running self-driving cars in the San Francisco Bay Area for some years now. I mean, we must be up in the 5 million miles driven in real live traffic. There's actually a service in operation in Phoenix, I am told. And I'm going to Phoenix tomorrow, and I'm going to try to get a ride in one of our Waymo self-driving cars. I'll probably leave my fingerprints in the back seat while I'm there. So the point here is that DARPA pioneered some of these ideas, new ways of doing business from the government's point of view. Government didn't do contests so much before that. And now many of the agencies in the government are thinking along those lines. So I think that the freedom to try stuff out is so important. And that's what we need in government, is to give our very talented people in the government sector some flexibility and freedom to explore new ways of getting stuff done.
I agree, like the ability to have that experimentation and try without having to fear the failure, because any success has many little failures along the way.
Amen to that.
And it is interesting. I'm even seeing governments around the world, they are starting to do more of this experimentation. So I think that's positive. And conferences like this help because you can do an exchange of ideas. So you kind of answered this question a little bit a while ago when we talked about what do you think the next big thing is, if there's one big thing?
There's a bunch of big things. I mentioned the satellite stuff is just that's on the kind of low level of internet and network connectivity. And you mentioned machine learning, which is simultaneously exciting and scary as hell. Partly because the training mechanisms are based on large quantities of data. The data could have biases, but worse, it could be bad data, period. And so you might be training a system to make all the wrong decisions, which is a really scary thing. You mentioned that we don't even know about it. It's hidden from us. That's even more scary, because now you have algorithms that are determining what we see and hear, what we experience, and it could very well be that those experiences and the decisions that those algorithms are making are not necessarily in our best interests. So that's something to be very concerned about. I think the other thing which is super exciting right now is that if you heard the terms like computational linguistics and computational astrophysics and so on, computational X is the big deal now. And systems like AWS and Google and Microsoft and so on provide huge computing capability to people who are interested in trying to use computational methods to do things. Some of the most recent Nobel Prize winners have won their prizes not for wet lab experiments, but for simulations that, of large-scale interactions and tiny little molecular things. So computational X is going to be a huge, big thing, and it will help us understand more and more about biology and health and all these other things that are filled with data but need a great deal of computation in order to sort things out and understand what the implications are.
So true. There's so much, and it is exciting, like you said, and sometimes a little scary. But now I have a couple of fun questions.
Okay.
As we end up here, is it true that the term surfing the internet is because of your last name? Is that true?
No, it's not. I wish it were. It's you know, it's just one of those delicious coincidences. But here's an example of the backstory. It's 1989, and 3 commercial internet services have just popped up in the United States. One was called UUNet, one was called PSINet, they were based in Virginia, and one was going to be called SURFnet in San Diego. What else would you do in San Diego, right? So they had this whole advertising campaign with t-shirts surfing the internet. And then they discovered that some outfit in the Netherlands was already called SURFnet because that was an acronym for a Dutch research organization that supplied networking to universities in the area. So somebody, this is General Atomics, was setting up this SurfNet. And so somebody said, oh, well, we can't use SURFnet. Why don't we change the name of our organization to CERF, California Educational Research Foundation Network? Then they called me up and they said, is it okay if we call our network SurfNet? And my first reaction was, oh, if they screw it up, am I going to be embarrassed?
Yeah.
And then I thought about it more. I said, wait a minute, people name their kids after other people, and if the kids don't come out right, they don't blame the people they named them after. So I said, sure, go right ahead. So in July of '89, I flew out to San Diego, and Susan Estrada, who was the director at the time, general manager at the time, and I took one of those plastic bottles full of glitter, and we smashed it over a Cisco router, and we launched the SurfNet.
That's a very good story. Well, I was thinking about my first email address the other day. I think it was an AOL one, but I don't remember. I think it was something like THC@OL, but I still have the same live email address I've had for over 24 years,
Wow,
I think.
that's amazing.
Do you remember your first email address?
Yes, because for me, email started in 1971. That was Ray Tomlinson at Volt, Beranek, and Newman set up the networked email. We all got very excited about that, and my emails were at USC, 71. I would have been, where was I? Oh, I was at UCLA, okay. So it was probably vsurf@ucla.edu, except that there was no .edu at the time. So it was just vsurf@UCLA. We didn't get the .edu stuff until 1984 when the domain name system showed up. And I still remember my MCI mail account, which I set up in 1983, and that was also vsurf. And I remember the number that was associated with it, 1050002.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Okay.
It was the third address in the.
Oh, it was the third.
There was 0, 1, and 2.
That was, of course, that's clever. All right, one more last question. So, as an Amazon executive, I hear you're a science fiction fan. So
Yes,
I've got
I
to
am.
ask, do you like an e-reader or do you like a hard copy book? Or is it combo?
Actually, I do both.
Okay.
I have Kindle running on my laptop. Some people will say, why aren't you doing it on your mobile? The answer is I have to have my laptop with me all the time anyway, so I just put the Kindle on there to avoid carrying 75 books under my arm when I travel. But I have a fairly extensive physical library.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that I will typically buy both a hard copy and the soft copy.
Yeah.
And I read the soft copy on the road, but when I'm at home, I kind of like having a real book there.
Yeah.
And it's also easier to put notes in the
Notations,
margins,
yeah.
which I didn't used to do because when I was a kid, I thought writing in a book was sort of like a crime.
Yeah.
And now I've
They'll take
become
it to the
much more
library.
comfortable with jotting down my reactions as
Yeah.
I'm reading the book, because it's fun later on to go back and pull
Yeah.
the book out and see what was I thinking.
I
at the time.
agree. Have you ever tried Audible?
I have not. Now remember, I'm hearing impaired,
that's
so
well,
Audible probably
I
doesn't
will
work
send
too
you
well
something.
for me.
There's something you might be able to use. But Audible, I even have to admit, if I'm just exhausted and I really want to know what's on those pages, I will use Audible.
Well, you don't have a protocol problem with a book, right? I mean, it doesn't have a battery. You do have to have some illumination.
Yeah.
But other than that, they last for quite a long time.
Yeah, they really do.
Compared to everything else. And for those of you who are worried about digital preservation, you should be worried about this. It's sort of, I'm worried that we have a digital dark age coming, because all this technology which is holding our content may not last forever. It's sort of like 5 1/4 inch floppies that are gathering dust in your closet. Try to find a 5 1/4 inch floppy reader other than in the Smithsonian right now. It's hard.
Yeah, it's so true. Thank you so much for your time today and spending it with us and all of our attendees here. You're
Well,
amazing.
thank you very much for having me here. I
Thank
appreciate it. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much. That was really sweet.
you.
Thank you.